Hey everybody, welcome to Therapy Today. Today we are doing a reaction video to Jessi Hildebrandt sharing her story and her reaction to Jodi Hildebrandt's sentencing hearing on the Mormon Stories Podcast. And Kitty is telling me that he wants to join us, so I'll let him get up and then we will talk a little bit more about what we're going to see today. So Kitty wants to be back on video. I know he's been absent for a little bit, so here he is. Basically what we'll be seeing today and reacting to is just an excerpt from a 2-hour plus long video that the Mormon Stories Podcast did with Jessi Hildebrandt. Jessi Hildebrandt is the niece of Jodi Hildebrandt, the former therapist who was charged and sentenced recently along with Ruby Franke and counts of child abuse. And along the process of the case, many other former victims of hers, former clients of hers had spoken out. Jessi Hildebrandt shared early on in this entire process, they had been under Jodi's care for about a year or so, and that they are still going through therapy, still going through healing to deal with the trauma. And so they've appeared on the Mormon Stories Podcast a number of times at this point, giving some insight on what Jodi Hildebrandt's thought process is, lending some credibility to some of the frankly remarkable and unbelievable stories about the abuses that have been perpetrated by Jodi Hildebrandt. And so the reason I wanted to bring out this excerpt today was because they are specifically talking about the work that they had done in therapy, work through their trauma to heal and to recover, what that means for them and the process that they used to get to that point. So as always, like and subscribe before we jump into this video. Make sure you can stay up to date with all of our updates, reaction videos, and other ways that we talk about education and advocacy for mental health. So like and subscribe. Let's dive into the video.
I'm triggered. I mean, I have complex PTSD from this. I have triggers daily that I've gotten pretty good at recognizing, and I've been fortunate enough to have a really amazing therapist that has helped me build tools to somatically feel those things and to process.
Let me pause real quick. When they talk about somatically feel, what that basically means is experiencing it in your body. A lot of times, a lot of therapies focus on what's going on up here and kind of ignore what's going on in the rest of the body. So there are some somatic kind of therapies that are about experiencing the emotion and engaging with the emotion instead of trying to avoid it.
But I know I can't say this for certain, but I suspect I will be dealing with this my whole life. This isn't just something that goes away. And I think people have this idea that healing means an absence of. And I think I've realized that healing it's actually the opposite. Healing is the presence of space, the presence of tools, the presence of mind, the presence of action plan, because trauma doesn't just go away.
She makes a really good point. I think a lot of my clients are hoping that, especially my clients who deal with trauma, they're hoping that at the end of therapy that they can just go back to life as it used to be. And that would be amazing if we could rewind time and go back to before they had their accident or before the abuse or before, whatever else may have happened to them. But Jessi Hildebrandt is right. That's not how trauma works. And so what we're looking for is for that trauma to no longer define your entire life. It may still interact and impact your life at multiple points. Like they talk about, they face triggers every day. This might be a lifelong journey for them, but it is no longer the narrative that dominates their life. The messages that they received and the feelings that they felt during that traumatic time with Jodi Hildebrandt are no longer the main parts of their lives. And they're right, what that means is having the ability, the tools, and the plans to be able to engage with triggers as they come, to be able to be present with yourself, even when things are very uncomfortable, when things are very scary, or even when we feel out of control with our bodies and with our feelings.
Things that have helped me significantly, journaling. I'm an avid journaler. If you don't like journaling, even just getting your phone out and recording yourself, just like kind of I used to call it a soul vomit, where I would write and just get everything out of my mind. Those types of practices help.
There is something to be said for journaling. Within a trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy approach called cognitive processing therapy, they actually emphasize journaling throughout the entire process and actually using pen and paper, because their research states that we actually engage better with our emotions when we are handwriting as opposed to just typing something out. But there is also something to be said for that unfiltered way of letting ourselves soul vomit, I think her word was, where a lot of times we feel like we have to keep it together, we have to say the right things, we have to act the right way, and allowing ourselves the freedom to just engage with our thoughts and our feelings can be very freeing and allow those emotions to kind of flow instead of being blocked.
Getting into the habit or getting comfortable with asking yourself really uncomfortable questions. And I guess what I mean by that is like what is considered shadow work. Getting to know those parts of us that we have rejected, getting to know those parts of us that we feel the most shame around. And it's very difficult. None of this is easy work.
As they're talking about shadow work and parts that we're uncomfortable with, two theories immediately spring to my mind. One is Jungian psychodynamic theory, where Jung talked about different archetypes and the shadow was one of the archetypes. So there's usually a lot of shame and hiding and secrecy around the shadow. But parts work is part of internal family systems theory. But what parts work is basically is that trauma tends to leave a wound, and then there are parts of ourselves called managers or protectors whose job it is to guard that wounded part from being hurt again. And so what happens is when we're triggered, when we get to a situation that's too close to that wound, then it'll throw up different barriers that'll distract us, move us away from getting too close to that very sensitive and hurt part of ourselves. And within internal family systems theory, that's where we get symptoms. Things like dissociation, things like nightmares or avoidance or loss of pleasure or feelings of depression, things like that are all to shield us from getting hurt again, even if those are maladaptive, even if those are hurting us in new ways. And so with what Jessi Hildebrandt is talking about, what parts work talks about, and what I assume the Jungian theory talks about is being able to learning to engage with those parts again, instead of being afraid of them, instead of being afraid of the hurt, being able to engage and dialogue with them, to feel the discomfort, feel the pain and the hurt again. And that allows us to reintegrate and heal those wounds.
But I promise you it is worth it. If you can, and if you do have access to resources like therapy, I know it's really difficult. I know it's really expensive. I know that it's kind of a crapshoot if you get a good one. But if you can get a good one, if you do have access to it, that is, especially if they are trauma. I mean, hopefully they're all trauma informed, but trauma informed therapy, specifically with somatic therapy and, like I said, internal family systems, which like parts work, has been so crucial to where I am today.
And Jessi Hildebrandt makes a good point. Yes, you don't know for sure how good your therapist is. And it's not even just like there are good therapists and bad therapists. There are some people who will work great with a certain type of person and be absolutely terrible for another. I know that's true for me. I'm not a universally great therapist. There are some people that I just click better with and some people that I don't. And that's not my fault. That's not the client's fault. It's just, if we're working together, then I have to do my best for them. But sometimes it just doesn't work out amazingly. What they are highlighting though is because some of this stuff seems so risky, because you are putting your money on the line, you're putting your relative comfort on the line, because it's my job to be able to push you to engage with those uncomfortable parts of you. That's why the therapeutic relationship is so important. If there's not that basic level of trust, that I can trust this person to guide me through those shadowy parts of myself, the parts of myself that I've been hiding away from for all these years, the parts that I've been avoiding thinking about, then it's not going to happen. And what Jessi Hildebrandt is saying is that for their process, at least, that had to happen. And that's why it was important to have a therapist that they could trust, a good one who knew what they were doing with the parts work, first of all, but then also that they could trust that therapist to walk them through that without re-traumatizing them or leaving them more hurt than they were before.
And the practice of self-witnessing. So something that I realized okay, sorry, I'm cutting. Let me
No,
recenter myself.
I have a really big question.
Yeah.
A lot of different angles to answer it from. So this is great. Thank you.
Of course. So when I cut my parents off about 2 years ago, what I realized what was happening was I realized that I was set in this mindset of, if they don't acknowledge it, I will never move on. They need to acknowledge it. They need to apologize. They need to validate me. Otherwise, I'm stuck. And I realized how disempowering that was. I realized how that will probably never happen. And getting to that point of letting that be okay was, it took a decade. But once I reached that point and realized that they probably will never give me what I want. And in reality, what I do want is, I need to start validating that. I need to start witnessing that. I need to start telling myself that these things happened and that my pain is real and my pain is valid, and starting these practices of self-validation and self-witnessing. And I remember the first time the practice, there's a lot of closing your eyes and breathing and putting your hands on your body, on your chest, just a connective grounding practice. And I remember the first time I just told myself, I see you. I see how much pain you're in. I see how angry you are. And I just started saying things like that. And I remember the first time I did that, just this complete breakdown that happened. And it was I had the little me, the parts of me that were, that were abandoned, the parts of me that were abused, were just desperate for this. And they have been screaming for this.
What Jessi Hildebrandt is talking about is that IFS especially is a very experiential therapy. It's not just, filling out worksheets or talking about things, but this is really diving into yourself, like they talked about a lot of times through mindful practice. So you talk about closing your eyes, breathing and meditating. There is some imagery and imagination involved, and I don't quite know all of the mechanics and the brain science behind it, but I have had clients who go through this, and it's a powerful and transformative experience for them to finally be able to say to that neglected part of themselves, the part that they've been running away from, hiding away from, trying to ignore, to finally recognize the pain that that part is going through and validating that. And that's more powerful than any other person in their life being able to say that to them and validating that emotion. I guess Kitty needs a hug right now.
And the moment I started doing this work of some people call it reparenting, some people call it inner child work. The moment I started doing this is when things started changing for me. And anyone that's listening that is interested in these, just a quick Google search: inner child work, shadow work, internal family systems. That will get you at least in the direction. There are many journal prompts that you can start asking these questions. It's a lot of self-work, the healing parts. And actually, though, kind of a different avenue of healing, though.
I will say, as they're talking about this, it is such a contrast to the way they were trying to cope before. They were talking about, they needed that validation from their parents. Either they needed their parents to apologize or to acknowledge that, oh, you've been hurt and we're sorry for that, before they felt like they can move on. But now what they were experiencing through this parts work, through the work that they were doing with their therapist, is that they had all the tools for healing and moving on within themselves. And all they needed to do, I say all they needed to do, it is still a very difficult process. I want to validate that for anyone who's dealing with trauma or any other mental health challenges, that sometimes it feels easier to want that validation from outside, to have your therapist say, oh, you're fine, your emotions are valid, or your parents or your loved ones to say that. But within IFS, we have the tools for healing within ourselves. And that can be very empowering once we are able to access those, once we're able to experience that for the first time. Kitty, are you done? If you're done, I'm going to put you down. Want to hang out?
That I've experienced in the last 7 months is the healing work that happens within community, and learning how to receive and learning how to be vulnerable with those around you and letting people show up for you. Because I think a pretty common experience that I've heard from other people that have gone through an immense amount of trauma is this hyper independence, this like avoidance of relying on anyone ever. And I know that I very much fell into that category of never wanting to be vulnerable with anyone ever.
That makes a lot of sense, considering they were relying on Jodi Hildebrandt as a caretaker, as a guardian during that time, and that trust was completely betrayed. They were abused emotionally, physically, spiritually during that time. It'd be very normal to not want to trust anyone again, especially in community, and putting yourself out there, making yourself vulnerable so that someone might have the opportunity to hurt you again. That's a no-go for a lot of people who experience trauma. But where I see parts work being very helpful for people is that once they're able to access that validation for themselves, once they're able to create that healthy dialogue with the inner parts that feel abandoned or hurt or abused, that once you feel that acceptance and validation for yourself, that starts naturally turning outwards. I've seen clients just start turning around and building healthy relationships, trusting relationships, because they have that feeling of solidity and foundation and groundedness within themselves to feel safe to reach out again.
Yeah.
And realizing that it was safe, like, because I did these years of self-witnessing and finally being able to feel like I can open up to people that I love and that love me. The amount of healing that happens within those spaces is just, it's indescribable. Like when you can just feel held by your community, by people that you love and cherish, and you can be your most torn apart self, and that they'll just hold the pieces together, has been just magic. All this being said, like you had mentioned, healing is not linear, and it's messy, and it doesn't stop. I think that's another thing at myself I have to remind myself of. I'm very much like a type A, achievement oriented type of person. And I'm like, okay, well, if I do all of the journal prompts and I do the ice baths and I am vegan and I run 5 miles and I do the breathing exercises, then I'll be fixed. And I think that's like actually a form of trauma that has come out of the perfectionistic aspects of Mormonism, the check boxes.
They make a really good point about the healing process. We want it to be like a broken bone, where it's very painful at first, and then you go and the doctor sets it, let it sit for a little while, it heals, and then you're back to normal. But think about it more as the continuing rehab process after having been in that cast for so long, that there's continued physical therapy, working those muscles and those, I don't know, I'll ask Dr. Mike about what happens after you break a bone and have to rehab. But there's a continued process of building those healthy habits, because you're retraining years of telling yourself certain things, years of avoiding certain parts of yourself. And now you're just relearning how to engage with those parts, with those emotions, allowing those to exist within you. And that takes a lot of continued work. And as they were talking about, it's not linear. There are going to be some weeks that feel terrible and you feel like, why did I even bother investing all of this in therapy and in myself? I'm right back at square one. And there are going to be some days where you feel like nothing can touch me and things are just going to be okay. But so that's where it's helpful to have that community, whether it's your therapist, whether it's a support group, or whether it's just your loved ones around you who are able to say that, I see your progress, I see where you've come from, I see how far you've come, so don't lose hope and keep pushing on, and we'll be here even if things fall apart.
So yeah, healing is painful, healing is messy, healing is not linear. It's not a one size fits all. But if I can offer any sort of guidance in terms of like directions to head into, Like I said, inner child work, internal family systems, self-witnessing, journaling, somatic work, feeling emotions. Like I don't know if you've heard this or not, but I remember the first time I heard it was news to me. Like, an emotion actually only lasts, I think, about 90 seconds in the body, like physically. And our resistance to feeling emotion is what keeps it going. And as I got better and better at recognizing when I had an emotion, like, and being able to be like, wow, I'm sad. And then just sitting in that. Wow, I'm angry. Wow, I'm, insert emotion, which goes back to the book I had mentioned earlier. Nonviolent communication is so good at this. It talks about like the difference between interpretation and emotion. So often we say things like, I feel like you're not listening, but that's not a feeling, that's an interpretation. And so,
Okay, I gotta pause them here. There's so much good in what they're talking about. Yes, we need to engage with our emotions. And yes, I don't know if it's 90 seconds, but emotions are short-lived. And in addition to resistance, the messages that we tell ourselves, in their terminology, the interpretations that we tell ourselves can perpetuate emotions. If I feel that something unfair happened to me and I keep telling myself that's unfair, I'm mad at the teacher, I'm mad at this person who did this to me, how dare they do that? Now I'm saying all of these messages that are perpetuating that feeling of anger or frustration or unfairness. And yes, absolutely, resisting an emotion can tend to give it more power as well. And for my guys who are watching this video, I know this is primarily a female audience based on the YouTube analytics, but for my guys who are watching this channel and this video in particular, one unique language thing that a lot of guys deal with is exactly what they were talking about. I feel like you're not listening to me. I feel like this is unfair. And we think we're talking about our feelings. We're actually talking about our beliefs. We're talking about what we tell ourselves. And in normal language, that doesn't have to be a huge deal. It's not something that you have to go grammar Nazi about. But within therapy work, that's super important because our interpretations and our feelings are different things. They influence each other, but we have to be able to distinguish between the two, or else we start going in circles with our emotions and what we're telling ourselves and aren't able to really escape that loop. To keep this rule of thumb in mind, if I can sum it up in one word, then maybe it's a feeling. I'm feeling upset, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling frustrated. If I need to complete a sentence at the end of the I feel, then it's probably an interpretation or a thought. I feel like you're not listening. So just a little thing to keep in mind. I say this to probably 80-90% of my male clients at some point during our work together.
So the closer we can get to what we're actually feeling and then validating that feeling, I think the closer we can get to healing.
Beautiful.
And I don't want to like scare people off, but I've also I've had more bad therapists than good.
Yeah.
But there are good therapists out there. And I have found people that are focused on things like somatic work, which is a trauma-informed type of therapy, and internal family systems. I really feel and believe that if those are their modalities that they're working in, they're probably going to be safer for people that have complex PTSD versus someone that does like CBT or any sort of just speak therapy. Because trauma is so, you can talk about trauma all day long, but if you're not letting yourself feel it and process it,
yeah,
you're going to find a plateau. You're going to find, at least that's something that I found. I reached this point where I was like, I've intellectualized this to the upteenth degree. I understand this in and out cognitively, and yet I feel so stuck.
I'll say really quickly, I appreciate that they're sharing this experience with CBT versus some of the somatic therapies. Like I talked about before, there is a branch of CBT called cognitive processing therapy that was specifically designed for military veterans who are dealing with trauma. And so there is a lot of experiencing within that system of cognitive processing therapy. They do that through journaling and through worksheets and through telling and retelling the narrative of their trauma. And so it's slightly different from the very experiential and somatic therapies that they're talking about, like internal family systems. But that's not to say that CBT is completely left in the dust if you're looking for someone to work with you through trauma. I think the main difference for CPT, cognitive processing therapy, is that it's very structured and very defined. I think it's like 12 sessions, and there's a script and a homework and a plan for each session just mapped out. And so for people who really work within that structure, that can be super helpful for someone dealing with trauma through that. And if you need something a little less structured, maybe internal family systems might be the way to look for you. But yeah, absolutely. This is why we have this channel at all, to advocate for people to be able to know what makes a good therapist and what doesn't. And they're absolutely touching on something super important here, that you have to be able to trust your therapist. You have to be able to know what you're getting yourself into so that you can feel like you're getting the best care and feeling safe to be able to explore all these uncomfortable parts of yourself.
And it wasn't until I started learning about sensation and how uncomfortable I learned that I was actually dissociating all of the time, out like using like hyper intellectualizing emotions as a form of self-soothing, so I wouldn't have to feel these emotions. And unfortunately, the only way out of it is through.
Yeah.
So
yeah, what Jessi Hildebrandt is talking about is one of the core pieces of internal family systems. They were dealing with triggers all the time, dealing with the potential of dealing with very uncomfortable, difficult feelings. And so in order to feel safer, they would dissociate, and that would make it so that they didn't have to feel those things. But they found out later on that that was happening, that that was not helpful for them. And when they're talking about the only way is through, by engaging, by choosing to feel and experience those emotions, that was the way that they were able to get through that.
so annoying.
Yeah. And I'm getting a lot of people in the comments saying, wait, there's really good life coaches out there, which is true. My wife Margie's a life coach. And there's also people saying master's level therapists can also be fantastic, which is also true.
I hope master's level therapists can be terrific. I think there is a little bit of a misconception. This is not super germane to this conversation, but it's not like they teach you extra secret techniques when you're in a PhD program. I haven't been through a PhD program, so I don't know. So if anyone has a PhD in counselor education or counseling in the comments, let me know if you have some secret techniques that they taught you in your doctoral program that I didn't get in my master's level program. But a lot of it comes down to where you specialize, what you do a lot of your residency and internship with, as you have supervisors who focus on certain things and what you pick up from them, as well as what you do your continuing education in, what you get certified in. Those are all ways that people kind of develop those specialties. And so having a PhD as your therapist does not guarantee that they're going to necessarily work better for you. What's important to look at is asking them where they did their residency, their internships, where they've focused their continuing education on, and that'll kind of let you know what their areas of focus and experience are instead of just what kind of degree they have.
I'll note that Jodi Hildebrandt was a master's level. I don't even think Jodi Hildebrandt was a therapist. Now that I have looked at her credentials, I think it was like ed psych or child.
She was, from what I understand, she was a family license, what are they called? She was a therapist.
I'm guessing what they're trying to say is licensed marriage and family therapist, LMFT, and yes, that is a master's level clinician. I don't know the exact rules in Utah for getting licensed, but she would have had to have the appropriate degree, do the appropriate number of hours of residency, and then take the proper test in order to be licensed. At least that's the way it works in Virginia.
She had a master's.
But I don't think her master's was in like therapy. But maybe she took the exam to get her therapy license. But last I looked, but I'm getting us off track. I apologize. There are scientific, empirically supported methods for treating therapy. Make sure that whoever you find use evidence-based approaches to treating trauma. And the more experience they have, the more expertise, the more training, the more that they've trained under an expert in evidence-based treatments for trauma,
Yes.
likely the better treatment you're going to get. And yes, that can be a coach or a master's level therapist, but just please think of it as an expertise, not as something that someone does just because they throw the word up on their website and tell you they've treated a lot of people with trauma.
And I know
They're right. It is not just about the degree that you have, but also the amount of training that they've gotten and the experience that they've had studying particular modalities, ways of doing therapy, either through continuing education, through their degree, or other classes they may have taken. Yeah, absolutely. It's important to have a conversation with your therapist. If my clients don't ask that in the first couple of sessions, I'll at least outline for them what are some of the things they're hoping to accomplish through therapy, and that's part of treatment planning. And then I'll talk them through what are some of the ways I've trained in that might help them accomplish those goals or reach those goals. And if those don't match up very well, then we have to have a conversation about that, whether they feel comfortable with us working with what I have expertise in and then moving towards their goals kind of obliquely in that direction, or if they want to change therapists. I'm not going to get offended by that because they need to do what's best for them.
And I know that if you've been through a significant amount of trauma, one of the things that I'm sure you're dealing with is not being able to trust yourself and trust your intuition.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're seeking out a therapist and something doesn't feel right, trust it. Because that if something is coming up in a way that feels constrictive or wrong, it probably is.
Some people hold intuition in higher or lower regard depending on who you talk to. But within parts work that Jessi Hildebrandt is obviously very comfortable in, it makes a lot of sense that we're getting messages from certain parts of ourselves and we like to ignore those in favor of being intellectual, like in their case. But sometimes within IFS, some of those intuitions, those messages are from parts of us that we normally neglect and may not trust. And so we might tend to ignore those messages to our detriment. And so what they're talking about, yeah, if you've got a gut feeling about somebody, don't necessarily stay with them just because it was so hard to land with a therapist in the first place. At the very least, you can bring that up as a conversation. Hey, something feels kind of off about our interactions. I don't know if you've been picking up on that. What do you think might be going on? And if they're not willing to engage with that conversation, that's a definite red flag. If they're not willing to receive feedback that they might not be the right person for you, that's a red flag as well. But yeah, basically the therapy room should be an empowering and free place for you to be able to share how you're feeling, up to and including how you feel about your therapist. All right, so that's the conclusion of the section that we're going to watch here today. Now, I know there are many more hours of Jessi Hildebrandt content, and I think they're all great to watch. I'll include the link in the description below so that you can watch the entire thing if you feel so inclined. But absolutely, I want to hear what they said about their own therapy process because like I said, I don't think that gets talked about enough. The conversation usually just ends at, oh, I'm in therapy. Okay, great. And there's a certain stigma about asking, like, hey, how's that going? And what are you trying to do? Or what's going on? What's your therapist doing for you in therapy? I hope that within how comfortable people are talking about their mental health, that's a conversation we can start having more, because part of the confidentiality is, of course, very vital for the counseling process, but also leads to a lot of people not knowing, or like Jessi Hildebrandt, having to go through trial and error period to find, oh, this isn't right, this isn't working for me, it's not supposed to be this way. And so the more we can actually talk about that, the more we can advocate for ourselves and be able to hold therapists to the standard that they agreed to when they filled out their licensing paperwork. But again, I do really appreciate through this entire process, Jessi Hildebrandt's openness about the trauma that they suffered, about the healing process, and how they're feeling and thinking about all of these events that transpired. I think it's a very helpful and necessary conversation about mental health and trauma that goes beyond just what's going on in the Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt cases. So everyone, thank you so much for checking out this video. Again, please like and subscribe. That helps our channel to continue growing and making content like this for you all. Thank you so much for checking out this video. I'll see you next time.